In this episode, I'll be going over verses from Exodus 21 that deal with the legal recognition or lack thereof that the Mosaic law gives to slaves versus to freemen. The distinction between slave and free has already been defined in previous episodes, but I want to address a particular interpretation from Dr. Joshua Bowen on the humanity or the human standing of slaves read from Exodus 21. Here's verses 21 through 27. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, he's not to be punished, for the slave is his money. When men strive together and hurt a woman with child, so that there is a miscarriage, and no harm follows, the one who hurt her shall be fined according as the woman's husband shall lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free for the sake of the eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free for the tooth's sake. The verses I just read to you are related to another discussion concerning the beating of slaves in the Bible, and I'm addressing that issue in another episode, just not this one, so stay tuned, because I'm not ignoring that topic. I just have it in the works for a future episode. Rather, this episode, I want to address the way the law here ostensibly appears to treat freemen and slaves under different laws. An interpretation I've seen from Dr. Josh Bowen suggests that these verses provide equal dignity to freemen when they have wrongs done against them, but slaves do not have the same rights according to these laws, ostensibly, according to Dr. Joshua Bowen's interpretation. The child who loses his eye in these verses, if he's the child of a free woman, he's granted eye for eye justice from his attacker in verse 24. And we also see in verse 27 that if a slave loses his eye on account of his master's actions, the law says that he should be granted his freedom on account of this. Dr. Bowen points out that verse 27 does not explicitly say that the slave should receive eye for eye justice, and therefore he concludes from this that therefore it wasn't supposed to be granted at all. But if you've been listening along with me in this series, you've already seen time and time again the dangerously faulty and presumptuous hermeneutic of making conclusions based on what is not in the text, instead of drawing deductions based on what is in the text. If you can't already see where I'm going with this, let me play the clip where Josh Bowen more fully articulates his position in a clip of him giving a critique of Paul Copan's approach. Here's the clip.
And this is maybe the more important part to me is verses 26 and 27, because he says, wow, they don't usually talk about this one. Well, I'm going to, and he's not going to like that I am, because if you read verses 24 and 25, it's following on this discussion about the scenario where two men are fighting and they accidentally hit a pregnant woman. And the pregnant woman loses her child, loses her fetus. If only the fetus dies, but the woman is not harmed, then there's just some sort of like a monetary settlement that's made, right? However, if the woman is harmed, then the text says eye for eye, tooth for tooth, burn for burn, foot for foot, wound for wound, all that stuff, hand for hand. So it sets up that rule of like lex talionis, right? The law of retaliation. And so what that means, of course, for those that may have not heard this before, if the man puts out the eye of the woman, then she has the right, or really her husband, has the right to the eye of the guy that put her eye out. And what that would mean then is that the guy says, whoa, 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 don't take my eye. I will pay. How much can I pay you for you to not exercise that right to put my eye out? And so now it sets the value of the eye in a really effective way. But what's interesting about 26 and 27 is that it doesn't say, And if a master gouges out or destroys the eye of a male or female slave, or knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave, then the slave has a right to the eye or the tooth of the master. Because the slave is not due lex talionis. They're not due the law of retaliation. They don't have a right to the master's eye. And that's a pretty significant thing. What they are due is to have their debt repaid, which is far less than they would have gotten ostensibly from having a right to the master's eye. Because putting out the eye is a really significant thing. So it shows that the slave is not on equal footing in the eyes of the law to that master.
So here, the conclusion Dr. Bowen reaches is that if the Bible dictates legal provisions for a man who is in a position of slavery concerning a case of compensation for grievances, it must mean that the other provisions the Bible already dictated for all men, whether he be slave or free, no longer apply. But where does Josh Bowen get this idea? Why does he just assume that previous provisions already stated are all of a sudden overthrown or no longer apply? Where does he get that idea? If a person is to have just and fair compensation for injury from an aggressor, and then the Bible says that a slave is to be set free if his master incurs injury, where in that does it say that the slave is not also entitled to just compensation? See, Josh is assuming an interpretation onto this text that it does not say. Namely, he's assuming that if the injured party is a slave, they are only allowed freedom, but no compensation. And while I agree with Josh Bowen that the slave is entitled to freedom in this case, I disagree with Josh that the slave is not also entitled to just compensation. It's very, very tricky how people are deceived by their own biases to fill in any space they can muster up finding with their own prejudices. Because when Dr. Bowen rightfully acknowledges that the slave is set free, and he analyzes that the cost of paying off that freedom from debt would be much less of a cost than the cost for compensation to an injured eye, which, in terms of cost differences, I will agree to for the sake of argument. For the sake of argument here, he then concludes that this means the man who was a slave was considered subhuman or of much less value than a man who was not in slavery. And that this distinction between the human value of men, if they were a slave or free, was seen here being taught in the law. But notice how he argues for this. He doesn't argue for this human value differentiation based on what's explicitly in the text. Rather, he argues boldly from texts that are not there. He emphatically establishes what is not said in the text.
It doesn't say that.
Yes, we know what it does not say, but what does it actually say? Because right then, he swoops right in to assume onto the text what he wants it to say in that ostensible void. This is the argument from silence we see time and time again that commonly and consistently comes from experts who are loose when it comes to rigor and being scrupulous before drawing conclusions. The assumption he has made here is that rules already established for the people of Israel do not apply to the slaves, be they Hebrew or foreign. Now, before I go over the verses that apply equal justice to both the Hebrew and the foreigner, let's just think about the wisdom of this law and how it's completely missed on Josh Bowen with his discarding of it. When the law establishes just compensation for injury, I submit to the listener that this law is an entitlement for any person living in Israel, slave or free, so that when the law of verse 26 is articulated for slaves, it is considered an extra provision on top of what is already entitled to them from the previous law. And it's a provision that necessarily needs to be articulated because of the unique circumstance such a case puts the slave in. Think about it. If a plaintiff sues for grievance and compensation, the defendant is liable to lose money in order to satisfy the injured party if the accusation is proven true. That could easily create bad blood between the accused and the accuser when it comes to divvying out payments and punishments. Obviously, But the law says that this justice needs to be observed and administered fairly. But now let's think about the case of a slave who's injured by his boss, his master. By this law, he has an absolute right to sue his master for cause. Do you see the conflict here? If the slave still has years left on his contract to serve out to this master, who he is reliant upon for his provisions to live and work off his debt, what kind of vulnerable position does that put the slave in if he has to show up for work the next day just after accusing his boss of abuse and collecting his due from that very boss he's still working under as a debtor and a slave? What kind of vulnerability does that put the slave in when he's able to be exploited even more from a boss who's already to be proven an abusive overseer? What kind of exploitative position would this force the slave to work under if the slave master has already proven to be abusive? Why should the slave still be obligated to work for such a guy? This law in verse 26 makes sure that he doesn't have to. And I hope the listener can see the wisdom of that, because it addresses the principle about avoiding these conflicts of interest. Well, Josh Bowen thinks that this law is in replacement of the previous law. I'm convinced this law is in addendum to the previous law. Dr. Bowen's interpretation loses out on that wisdom, on the wisdom of this law, and instead supplants it with injustice. Dr. Bowen argues from silence. I'm arguing from what is there. And furthermore, the fact that I believe the law equally applies to all the people of Israel, regardless of if they were slaves or free, is because the law itself requires such an administration of justice. Exodus chapter 23, verse 6 through 9 says, "You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge. Do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." Here in Exodus 23, just 2 chapters after Exodus 21, Exodus is demanding the justice for those who are poor, to judge fairly, not based on slave status, but based on moral status. That is, judge based on righteousness. And that this is due to the foreigner as well, who, if you remember, were taken into Israel initially as slaves. This is given as a reminder to Israel that they too were slaves in Egypt. And this is all iterated in verse 6, that this justice should not be denied to a poor man in his lawsuit. Do you see how this is directly related to the debt slave in lawsuit with his master? This verse is more than enough to prove Joshua Bowen has inaccurately and eisegetically handled the text in Exodus 21 to make it appear as if the text is denying justice to the slave, when in reality the text is paying special attention to the slave concerning lawsuits he may be in, so that justice is served even to him. But let's look at more verses, 2 more verses actually, to solidify this. Leviticus 19, verse 15 says, "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor." And in Deuteronomy 24, verses 14 through 15, "You shall not oppress a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether he is one of your brothers or one of the sojourners who are in your land within your towns." Okay, so I hope I've made clear that the presence of the law in Exodus 21, verse 6 does not deny a slave justice, nor is it in replacement of any compensation the master owes the slave for his injury. Rather, it ensures justice by entitling an additional protective measure on account of the abuse that slave has been under. Okay, let's look at one more clip from Josh Bowen on Myth Vision.
If an ox is known to gore and the owner doesn't do something to restrain it, and the ox gores a free man or a free woman or a free child, then the owner's life is forfeit. Now, he can ransom it if the family wants to do that, like he can pay them to get out of being killed. But then the text says, if it gores a slave, 30 shekels of silver is paid to the master of the slave. It's property law.
Again, in this case, the same mistake is made by Dr. Bowen yet again when the law clearly states that the owner of a known goring ox is to be held liable for any injury that ox causes, even up to the death penalty. But Dr. Bowen then throws that law to the wayside when the next law articulates that the master of a slave who is injured by a known goring ox needs to receive some compensation as well if his slave is unable to work off the debt owed to him due to the ox owner's irresponsibility. Now, does this mean the ox owner does not owe compensation to the slave himself for the injury caused? No. It does not mean that. This is just, again, another example of the law stepping in to observe a special circumstance of grievances that can be claimed in particular circumstances without nullifying the previous grievances already stated. And any claim that says that it does nullify has to prove that instead of assuming it. Because any time Dr. Bowen claims it, he never proves it. He only points to what is not said in a particular section of Scripture, while at the same time he ignores what is clearly stated in other parts of Scripture, and then proceeds to assume onto the text his own prejudices. And this proclivity to assume onto the Bible things that are not there at all, and in contradiction of what is there, is blatantly seen to be happening in this very next clip, when Dr. Josh Bowen begins comparing the laws of Moses to the laws of Hammurabi, and then claims that they're basically the same ethics being taught, found throughout the ancient world. Listen, as the conflation he uses is forced beyond what the texts even allow.
But here, let me just read to you. So Exodus, we can do this one from memory, right? Exodus 21:20. If a man beats his male or female slave with a wooden rod and they die immediately or under his hand, he will surely be punished. But if he survives a day or two, then he will not be punished because he is his silver, right? Let me just read to you Laws of Hammurabi 115 and 116. If a man has a claim of grain or silver against another man, distrains a member of his household, and the distrainee dies a natural death while in the house of her or his distrainer, that case has no basis for a claim. If the distrainee should die from the effects of a beating or other physical abuse while in the house of her or his distrainer, the owner of the distrainee shall charge and convict his merchant, and if the distrainee is the man's son, they shall kill the distrainer's son. And if the man's slave, he shall weigh and deliver 20 shekels of silver. Moreover, he shall forfeit whatever he originally gave as the loan.
One question on what you read earlier, where it talked about killing the person's son, or at least something there. Doesn't the Bible have kind of this eye for an eye, tooth for tooth idea where you're able to go and kill, like if someone killed your brother or your son or something, you can go and kill their family member. You like legally are allowed, unless they end up in one of these cities that are like refuge, like they're able to escape and they're in the safe spot, but you're not allowed to kill them in that spot. But like, it's really archaic sounding the way that they kind of spell it out.
The law of Hammurabi clearly stated that if a man's son or daughter is harmed, then justice, according to Hammurabi, is not that the perpetrator is due the harm, but rather the son or daughter of the perpetrator is due harm. Does this sound like justice to you? It didn't sound like justice to Moses, which is why Moses wrote laws that completely overthrew such an idea of morality when he wrote in Deuteronomy that sons are not to be punished for the sins of the father. That is not generally the same law. That is totally opposite law. And yet, Josh Bowen tries to conflate it as if, yeah, it's all the same law, nothing new here. Very, very disappointing to see these self-described scholars act as if Talionic justice in Hammurabi is the same as the justice taught in Moses. And the commentator, who goes by the name of Mythvision, says, well, isn't there a law in the Bible saying that you can kill a man's brother if he kills your brother? What? Where did he get that idea? Not only is punishing a perpetrator's brother for the perpetrator's crime not taught in the law of Moses, but it's forbidden in the law of Moses. And the whole time, Myth Vision said that. The other two self-described scholars were just nodding their heads, never correcting him. As if that law from Hammurabi was coming from the Mosaic Code. This is the absolute irresponsibility and pure nonsense coming from some of the academic social media space when it comes to the Bible, by these self-congratulatory crowds that don't even recognize their own biases, completely clouding the way they handle the text. They really are as bad as the apologists they despise so much. Here's that same Myth Vision, ironically, looking down his nose on the apologists and accuses them of doing the exact thing he himself just blatantly did.
Yeah. So technically, apologetics is kind of a joke to the serious scholars in terms of...
Well, it's a fundamental violation of our own kind of methodologies. You're starting with the answers before you even know the questions.
Right, Myth Vision, right. Because so-called serious scholars would never misrepresent what the text of the Bible actually says, in contradistinction from Hammurabi, right? You've never done that either, right?
Doesn't the Bible have kind of this eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth idea where you're able to go and kill, like if someone killed your brother or your son or something, you can go and kill their family member? You like legally are allowed.
It doesn't say that.
The verses covered in this video brought up the issue of beating slaves. And if God's law is perfect, one might ask, how can it ever be considered good to beat a slave or someone who is in debt? And that will be the focus of the next episode in this series.